Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is Grief and Grace. If we've never met, my name is Dave Bailey. I work for the largest provider of funeral services in North America. And from the perspective of someone who has personally experienced deep grief and who works with grieving families every day, one of the beneficial things that I see taking place in the middle of this health crisis and social unrest is that now perhaps more than ever conversations about grief are welcome and have a place of importance and prominence. So thank you for being here and being a part of it tonight. Please feel free to give us a like, which will help us and help the reach of this program. As well, if you know someone that could benefit from this, why don't you go ahead and tag them in the comments. They'll get a notification and they can come and be a part of this. And if you're watching, just say hi in the comments. We'll know that you're a part of tonight. My guest this evening, and I'm really excited about this, is Linsey Whissel Fenton, who is a senior producer and director at WPSU Penn State. She's an award-winning storyteller and the producer of a new documentary entitled Speaking Grief, which is a multi-platform public media initiative aimed at creating a more grief-aware society. So, welcome, Linsey.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm super, super glad that you are here with us. So, Speaking Grief, this amazing project. And I screened it last week and it just literally gave me chills. And I thought about the hundreds and hundreds of families that I've dealt with over the years and how much I would have loved to have had a resource like this to connect them to put into their hands. So I want to ask you how this project got started, what you learned, where this whole thing is going. But before I do, why don't we just show the trailer and give people a sense of what this project is all about.
There's so much individual experience in this life. There are so many different varieties of relationship and family and community. The one thing we are always going to have in common is that it hurts to lose the people we love.
My granddaughter.
My mother.
My sister and my dad.
Everybody you meet is going through something.
My daddy.
They're dealing with something. They're losing someone.
My son.
Grief is natural and normal. All of us do it, but oftentimes we say, oh, this feels too uncomfortable. I don't want to feel this. And we don't leave spaces for real responses.
Suppressing grief, leaving it in the corner where we never talk about it unless we're forced to, that has created an epidemic of unspoken grief in this culture.
We know that in general, people who experience the death of a loved one can still go on to lead very happy, healthy lives. We also know that without appropriate support or enough support, that can be very difficult. So the social support piece really becomes critically important.
Most people have really good intentions and they really want to support their person. The problem is that we're taught the wrong ways to be of help.
Grief work is about humanity. It's about the work that we do to create a real safe environment for all of us to do the work of loving, to do the work of losing. It's about the work that we do on being more human.
My ex-husband.
My twin sons.
My dad.
My stepdad.
My son.
My dad.
My cousin.
My babies.
If we want the kind of culture where we feel cared for inside our deepest pain, and we feel capable and confident in caring for our people's pain, our friends, our family members' pain, then we need to open these conversations about grief. They're really conversations about love.
I can't tell you how many times I've watched that trailer, and I still get a catch in my throat when I look at it. Tell us how this whole project got started.
Thank you for your kind words. I appreciate that. This actually started probably about 4 or 5 years ago. A now retired colleague of mine named Patty Satalia had wanted to do some sort of project on specifically grieving the death of a child. And that idea kind of started and stopped a few times. And then eventually I got involved and we started just looking into grief. And within probably a day or two of me poking around and doing some research, it became really clear what a need there was for this in our culture. Kind of shockingly so when you think about how it's like the only universal thing that we will all go through, but we just don't ever bring it out into the light, so to speak. And so from there, I kind of latched onto it and became really passionate about it over the last few years. And then we were fortunate enough to make a connection with the New York Life Foundation, who've just been wonderful collaborators and have done a lot in this field. And I always say this is projects like this are the reason I wanted to go into public media, because it's a platform that really has potential, I believe, to actually make an impact and enact change, because we do so much more than just programming. We really look at issues that need to be addressed and where we can add value to them. And so the only other thing I'll say is what's been interesting when a lot of people ask me the question about how this project started, is I think there tends to be an assumption that I have had a really profound personal experience with grief. And I've definitely had losses in my life, several actually since starting my work on this project, but I haven't had one of those. I always borrow the phrase from author Megan Devine, one of those losses that reorders the world. And I think it's sort of interesting that there's an assumption that somebody would only be as passionate as I've become about grief if they were personally affected, which sort of speaks to exactly why we need this project. Is this something we all have a stake in?
Isn't that the truth? So one of the things you talk about in the trailer is how you use the word that there's an epidemic of unspoken grief. And as I've done this Facebook Live, that's one of the things that's become so clear to me, how there's so much unexpressed grief, both for people personally as well as in our society and our culture as a whole, what Esther Perel calls psychosocial grief. And typically we're not given either permission or vocabulary to talk about it.
Absolutely, and I love Esther Perel. I love that you mentioned her. Yeah, and it's weird because, again, this project started several years ago, and there's no way we could have predicted that it would be released at a time of such unprecedented communal, societal, global level grief as during the current pandemic that we're in. But even stepping back from sort of that massive, obvious illustration of grief, one of the things I've become really attuned to since starting this work is that grief shows up everywhere. It's like in every song and every movie and every book and in so many people's just day-to-day interactions, but we never name it as grief. So that's one thing I think I've become really conscious of, is paying attention to all of those different kinds of griefs and smaller griefs, and how often we actually have a grief experience or a grief reaction, but we don't name it as such. And I think until we start naming it and recognizing it, it becomes really hard to appreciate that shared sense of that this is what makes us human. This is something that we all share, that we all go through, and we can all connect on. But until you recognize your own grief, it's hard sometimes to sit with and recognize the grief of others.
So totally true. So totally true. Our culture often tends to think of grief as a problem to be solved, that somehow it's a negative emotion. and something that needs to be fixed. We never talk about fixing happiness or fixing joy, but we'll talk about, fixing grief. Talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I think we really love, well, first of all, I think we love to label everything in these sort of binary categories just throughout our society. And so we love the good emotions and the bad emotions, air quotes. And I think in a society like ours where we're so really into people being happy, and there's books on how you can get your happiness, and there's all these steps to being happy, and we all want to project that perfect looking life on Instagram. When you think of that as the goal, then of course it seems like anything that would cause you sadness or pain is a deviation from that goal. So I think that's sort of how this idea of us needing to fix this problem is. It's a deviation from what we're setting out to achieve. And also productivity. I think that's a huge thing, is like we're really into being productive and efficient and bucking up and moving forward. And so I think, grief destroys all that. It just does so much to your life on a mental, emotional, physical, logistical level. It really redirects things. And so when you look at it from that perspective of, it does disrupt happiness, it disrupts productivity, and it lets in not only sadness but a lot of anger.
Yes.
Huge amount of anger, and we again label anger as a bad emotion. And so when again you look at things as good or bad, grief taps into a lot of those. But I don't need to tell you, there's also a lot of joy and love in grief as well. But that can be problematic too, because we don't like to think of those things as sitting side by side. So it's like either you're grieving or you're happy in this moment, and that we don't hold space for both of those things to coexist at the same time.
Yes. It's one of the things, I think I mentioned it on our last program. We tend to use the word "or" a lot. I'm sad or I'm happy. I'm crying or I'm laughing. But grief is much more of an "and" process. I'm sad and I'm joyful for the time that I had. I'm crying and I'm laughing at some intimate memory that it's very much an "and" process, and it's hard for people to give themselves permission to do that. They're grieving the loss of a loved one, and they're out somewhere and somebody tells a joke and they start laughing and they feel suddenly guilty. Why am I experiencing joy? Is it okay to experience joy while I'm experiencing grief? And the reality is yes. It's an and process.
Well, and other people project that onto grieving people as well. I think especially because we don't talk about grief and we don't understand it really well, we see that. We see somebody laugh, or we see them sort of relaxed and having a good time, maybe for the first time since their experience that triggered their grief. And we're like, oh, okay, they're done. You're done now. You're fixed. You're better. And it's just like humans don't work like that. And, I think life is an "and" experience, but definitely grief. And even, again, you can't talk about grief right now without recognizing the situation we're in. It's like I can say, okay, yes, I'm grateful every morning that I get to spend a little extra time with my dog drinking my coffee at a leisurely place because I'm working from home, and I'm really grieving a whole lot of things right now because of this situation. Like both of those things can exist at the same time.
True. So true. So this whole project, you're learning, you're having some amazing conversations with grief trauma specialists. You look back on this project, what would you say is the greatest thing you learned, or the greatest insight that you got from all of this?
There's probably two things. One is something that's really stuck with me is people's surprise at their own grief experience, because we have such an out of whack idea of what grief is, and that grief is this process and it's this short-term thing. I had so many people share going into their own grief experience that they thought they would be sad for a couple months and then they would, pull it together and move on. And sort of the surprise and the shock of realizing that it is this thing that becomes integrated into who you are and into your life as you go forward, and it's not something that's a one and done, that you complete some steps and then you never grieve again, that it's, grief is with you as the form of the relationship with that person or that thing that you're grieving. So I think that was one thing, was just realizing how damaging the messaging that we have around grief is to other people, to people who internalize that, and then that plays out into the support community, in terms of also projecting that onto people, that they should be done with their grief at a certain time or hit some certain benchmarks that we all kind of make up, depending on who we are. And I think the other thing along with that is just how critical it is that we get better at this because of those secondary losses, like when people pull back because they're uncomfortable, how cruel that is. And we don't mean it that way, but how unintentionally harmful those actions can be. And again, I don't think it comes from a place of wanting to cause pain, but just a place of discomfort. And so the importance of just validating what grief is, that it is hard, not trying to take it away from somebody, does so much for, from a support perspective, and also with your own grief, as I think we tend to downplay our own grief all the time because we get these messages.
And I think you mentioned something I think it's worth just kind of settling on it for a moment. You talked about secondary grief, and you don't hear a lot of people mentioning that. But for some people, whatever the grief event was leads to serious secondary grief. For some, that's the loss of the primary breadwinner and the loss of a home or a stable economy, or becoming food insecure, or even losing the ability to go hang out with a bunch of other couples without feeling like a fifth wheel, or losing family events. All of these knock-on secondary events that happen, secondary griefs that sometimes don't get recognized by people. It's like, so you lost your loved one, deal with that, but there's downstream, there's so many grief events.
And I think that speaks again to grief being integrated into your life, because a lot of the secondary losses don't necessarily emerge right away. They might come out through time, and some of them are more logistical, as you talked about, and everything down to like your loss of your identity and your sense of who you were. If you're a parent of an only child and your child dies, are you still a parent?
Yes.
I mean, I would say yes, you are, but that plays into how you see yourself and your role in the world. And I'll say that's one thing about this project that I think is a little bit different than some other things that have been done on grief. Is one of the biggest secondary losses that we saw, again, is something we could address using the platform of public media, is the loss of other relationship. And because so many people have had that experience where people have literally turned and avoided them in grocery stores or on the street because they're so uncomfortable. And so we thought, wow, if we can get people more comfortable with grief with their own, we can also get people more comfortable sitting in a space and holding space with other people's grief, so that maybe we can stop at least that level of secondary loss. We can stop the person who would not call or not show up to their friend or neighbor or loved one because they felt uncomfortable, and give them a little bit more confidence in showing up in those situations, so at least maybe some of those relationships don't go away.
Yes, I loved actually what you did in the documentary around that, and just really, some ideas for support personnel, friends and family and whatever. Yeah, it was really well done. Really, really well done. So Speaking Grief is more than just this documentary. So talk to us a little bit about what you see as the scope of this project, and about the website, and where you see this going.
Absolutely. And that's, again, I think something really unique to the public media system is that we like to look at it as a full initiative. So we have the documentary that's just actually one pillar of a larger project. And you mentioned the website, so speakinggrief.org is the site. And we have a lot of other video content there for people who want to learn more about the families in the documentary. But we also have additional stories of grief to illustrate how many different ways it can show up. And we'll be adding those throughout the summer. But then we have a lot of resources, both for grieving people and for people looking to be supportive in terms of video content, text content, infographics, and we're still adding to that. It's a really robust site that I encourage everybody to really spend some time with and come back to as they're able. We also have, we're doing a lot on social media, so people can follow us at WPSU Grief on Instagram and Facebook, and we're really trying to tap that as not just a promotional tool for the project, but as a learning space, and that maybe somebody's just scrolling through and they see a graphic that just maybe seeing that one graphic or that one quote might reframe how they think about grief a little. And then the biggest thing that got sidelined right now is we were doing a big push around outreach and events. So on the site, there is a link that anybody, no matter how big or small your organization is, can request to do a screening. We have an event toolkit. We will send you a copy of the film because we want to get this out there. We don't just want this to be something you watch and it's one and done. We want to actually engage people in conversation. So we had a lot of events lined up, and COVID had some other plans for us, but a lot of those have just been rescheduled, or we're looking at how to do events virtually to make sure that this is still something that we start conversations around. And then, our team now is even brainstorming about what we can do as the next phase of this, because we would like to keep growing this and think about what other resources we can create, what other content we can create, and really exploring what we've opened here with starting this conversation.
Yes. So tell us again, on Instagram, it is?
At WPSU Grief.
Okay.
So that's Instagram and Facebook. I think if you search Speak in Grief, it will also show up for both. And then speakingrief.org is the website.
Yes,
and
we have that up
information.
on.
There's information about the film, about holding events, and then again, a lot of those just more instructional resources.
Yeah. I when you said the website was robust, you're not joking. There are so many resources on the website. Just on the Understanding Grief tab, you have different sections like we all grieve differently. Grief has no timeline. There is no step-by-step process. Grief is not a single emotion. Grief is physical. Grief impacts our brains. Secondary losses are a part of grief. Kids grieve differently than adults, and childhood bereavement resources. And if you click on each one of those, they're a hyperlink to a page where there's video and text and information, and it's it's incredibly robust, and you're continuing to build that out on an ongoing basis as well. So it'll be a kind of this living, growing grief resource for people.
Yeah, that's definitely the plan, and that's we have, like I said, a lot of even stories that we haven't even released yet. People who shared their stories for the website. We're hoping to add more to that. We have, I think, a new one being released every week now through October, and then again, we're hoping to find a way to continue that. We also, through the support of New York Life Foundation, were able to run a mini grant program earlier in the spring. So we awarded, I want to say it was 27 mini grants to both grief organizations and public media stations around the country, so that they can either host events, or the public media stations are doing some of their own radio reporting on grief. So we'll be even adding to that from other contributing stations around the country. And I do also want to say on July 15th, I have to look up the time, and there'll be information for this on the website. We're going to be doing a national Facebook Live event. So we'll be streaming the film for the first time on that day. Yeah, and having a panel discussion. And the full documentary will be available on the website later in the year. I want to say by the end of August. We're still working out the exact date within our distribution guidelines, but our goal is definitely to make that publicly available.
Wow. I'm glad you gave a shout out to New York Life, their foundation, for their support on this project, and their investment in child bereavement support. Just amazing. And if you're looking for some of those resources, you'll find a link under child bereavement resources for New York Life has a page, achildingrief.com, just one word, achildingrief.com, and you'll find another world of resources for children and teens and their support network. So this has been aired on a lot of public media stations, but how can people find out whether their local station is airing it and get it into the rotation if it's not already scheduled?
So there's a link on that site called right when you land. It's find an air date. So we update that as we get new air dates in. I think it's updated through the next few weeks, and I know other stations are still adding it. We're at about, I think 60% of stations so far have scheduled it, but there's still a lot we're trying to hit. So there's also information on there if you don't see your station for how you can reach out to your programming director at your local public television station, because they do have an obligation and a responsibility to serve their community.
Yes.
So if people start making requests, and they do take that into account in their programming situation or decision making. And so there is also guidance on that link about how to phrase your request, who to get in touch with,
Yes.
And just request that they schedule an air date.
Yeah, after I saw after I saw the documentary, was one of the first things I did was get online and see, hey, are we showing this in Houston? And
we need it in Houston too.
I
we
know.
have Houston family. So we're working on it.
Yes, and Bo's Place and whatever. So I sent an email to the programming directors like, hey, get with this program. And I wanted to say again, you did mention it, but let's just go back and mention this again. There is a way for people to host a local event where Speaking Grief is shown, and there is guidance for roundtable discussions, and maybe the people to get involved, and material, small groups, and it's, I mean, you've got a really well-developed program online as to how people could host an event like this.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, same thing on that website. One of the first things that pops up is host an event, and there's a really simple form to request a screener. And again, then there's resources and an event planning guide that I think helps with both logistics and discussion tools for thinking through whatever that may look like, however big or small. And again, we're kind of pivoting and looking at virtual events as well. So we definitely want to get this out there, and we encourage people. And if you have questions, we're happy to work with your organization and help facilitate that.
Wow, I cannot tell you enough how amazing speakinggrief.org the website is, and really encourage you to go there and begin to click through and look at the resources, and it's one of those websites that you'll want to refer to on an ongoing basis, and you'll want to refer friends and family to. You'll see something on there, you'll see a comment, you see a piece of video, and you'll know this is important for me. So I always try to close our live with one simple idea that people can hold on to. So let me ask you this. If you could say just one thing to people that are dealing with grief, what would it be?
It would just be, you're not alone. And that's what we try to do through the site, is share as many stories as we could. That because grief is such a taboo thing in our culture, that we tend to hide it away, and people feel really isolated. So you're not alone. There's so much grief out there that we're trying to get people more comfortable in sharing. And just real quick on that note, I do want to always give a shout out to the families who trusted us with their story, and who had the amazing courage and strength to share their stories and to start speaking their grief, to sort of set this example for the rest of us. That is, if anyone's ever been on camera, it's never easy to be interviewed for anything, and speaking about something so deeply personal with such grace is really impressive. So always shout out to the families.
Yeah, totally. And I know that when you get a chance to watch the documentary, it'll be like my experience. I mean, it just feels like your heart opens up. Grief is the one universal shared human experience. We might not be able to identify with some of the things that other people talk about, but we can identify with grief. So Linsey, incredible having you here tonight. Thank you. Thank you for you and your team, and every all the work that went into creating this project. Absolutely amazing. Thank you to New York Life for helping to support this, but WPSU and all the work you do there with your team. I said to you when we talked that not only is the material in the documentary amazing, the quality of the documentary is amazing as well, and I just yeah, I'm excited to see where this all goes and the amount of people that it will help. But it is an incredibly important conversation. So thank you from the bottom of my heart.
And,
yeah.
well, thank you for the great work that you're doing and for having me tonight.
Thank you. All right. So if you've gotten some value out of this, please feel free to share it. Again, go to speakinggrief.org. Check out the listings there to see if it's being shown in your area. Contact your local programming director. Request that it be added. All of that. Even after this live is over, you can still leave comments or questions. I'll be coming back to review them, and we can interact as we go forward. And don't forget to click on notifications so that you can get a reminder whenever it is that we're ready to go live. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you again to Linsey and to Speaking Grief. And we'll see you next Monday.
There's so much individual experience in this life. There are